Okay, so we talked about the monitor you might choose, right? And we here see a different components we talked about we need for a color managed workflow. Well, we talked about the monitor and how to choose that and what are some of the key components you might be looking for. And of course, the more advanced you are, the more you want to increase your standards. Some of those settings might add up to more additional settings and the price of the monitor might go up, but I didn't talk about that all that much because my opinion, most of people who are watching this or going to be retouching are not going to be in that level or may not have the budget, or if you want to, you can always research for each model separately. Well, we can also take into account the ambient light and the calibration device we're going to use for our monitor to create a profile. Well, we need to talk about not just the ambient light, which we will talk about, but first we're going to specify the hardware calibrator, what the calibration and profiling process is, what are some of the calibration devices you might choose, and also we needed to create our monitor profile. And in order to do that, we need to specify when we're calibrating our monitor, we need to specify at least 3 basic settings, target settings. Okay, so no matter what calibration device you choose on the market, you would at least have these 3 different targets you need to choose. You need to specify during your calibration process. So that will be the white point, which is essentially the color of the white, or how what is the color your brightest point on your screen. We also need to specify the tonal response curve, which is essentially gamma, usually specified with gamma value. And we need to take into account the luminance, or what is the brightest, how bright the brightest point in your screen is. So the white point is the color of white. Gamma is usually what we refer to as the tonal response curve of your display. We'll talk about that later. And also we have the luminance. Right, so we need to specify at least those 3 targets. Some monitors, some calibrators will also give you an option to specify a black point or to specify a contrast for your display. If you have an option to specify a black point and almost certainly the white point or how bright it is, then you can adjust, you can move them closer or more apart, and you can adjust the contrast that way. But whatever the case, almost certainly you will always have these 3 targets to choose from when you're calibrating. So let's take a look what they are and why would you choose one over the other. So let's start with the white point, which represents essentially what is the color of your white or the brightest point. And this is measured in kelvins, which is the unit for temperature. And also the idea comes from this theory about black body, which is a perfect black body that if you heat it up to a certain temperature, it will glow in a different color essentially. But if you want to learn more about it, Google for black body radiator and color temperature. And the idea is that at about 2000 kelvins it will be more orange yellowish, and then if you heat it up it will gradually become less yellowish, more whitish, and go into bluish type color, right? But this is also somewhat subjective in terms of how we perceive it. So let me explain what I mean. Let's say this is the white point. Let's say this is 5000 kelvins. If you were to increase the temperature or the target temperature of your monitor, it will become what appear more bluish. On the other scale, on the other direction, it will become more yellowish, right? Well, let's say that for the sake of this demonstration that the so-called daylight color is 5000 kelvins, or more specifically D50. And D50 is a specific what they call standard illuminant. So if you have the option to calibrate to D50, that's more accurate than 5000 kelvins. So if you have that option, calibrate to this standard illuminant. This could be D50, D55, D65, corresponding to that number of temperature in kelvins. So in this case, let's say we have 5000 kelvins, okay? Let's say that's something we perceive as white. And this loosely describes daylight at a certain time of day. But it's not super accurate but that's, I don't know how they got to this point. Somebody mentioned that they compared a bunch of color temperatures and they asked a bunch of people which one does look more white to you, and somebody said this one. So, but it's quite subjective in a way. But still, in certain industries and in certain situations, it is used as a standard. We'll talk about this a little bit later. So for right now, let's assume that 5000 kelvins is a daylight temperature, and let's say that's white, right? If you go more to the right, you would make it more. If you increase the temperature, it will become more white, more blue. If you go the other way, it will become more yellow. Well, here's the problem. Our eyes are quite subjective and can easily adapt, right? So let's say that you calibrate to 6500K or D65, and there's no other reference points. Well, your eyes will adapt to something that used to be more blue, and it will become, in your mind, white. And when that becomes white, everything else becomes then, depending on what color temperature is, more yellowish or more bluish. In this case, what used to be white, 5000K, remember, would now appear more yellowish, and 65,000K, which used to appear more blue, would now appear white, if you just give your eyes a little bit time to adjust. And also not just to adjust, but if there's no reference point, if this is the brightest thing in your room, right, your monitor, and there's no other monitors or anything like that around, then your eyes will over time, and quite quickly actually, adapt and will think of that as white. That's why we can't really trust our eyes. That's why we need some kind of a measuring instrument, because that's all great and good if you don't care about the consistency of color, right? But if you send this to somebody else on another monitor or on some other viewing conditions for print, and it won't match, despite you thinking it's white. So that's why you need to measure it with an instrument that's more objective. And conversely, as we just saw, if you go the other way, if you calibrate to, let's say, 4500K, and you give some time, your brain will think that's white over time, and then everything else will appear more blue, any other more higher temperature. So it's very easy to confuse your eyes, which are not designed for this kind of work, for consistency. So what I would recommend is that you use your calibration device to be more objective, right? So let's pretend that 5000K or D50 is the daylight color. That's what usually they refer to it. But it's loosely based on that. As you just saw, it's quite subjective, or it can be quite subjective. So for example, the ISO standard for printing and seeing prints, well, they recommend 5000K. If you're preparing for print, for a web, if you're preparing for a web or just a general environment, they recommend 6500K or D65. So as you can see, the standards might change, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the ambient light, which plays a significant role. So that will be the color of white, right? That's how we would think about the color of white, or the white point setting. Well, let's talk about the luminance, because that's the very easy one. Luminance is measured in something we call candelas per meter square. It's just a unit of measurement that basically describes how bright your screen will be, how bright your whitest point will be. Now, most monitors outside of the, when they come out of the box, are quite bright, and they usually have, maybe 200 or even 300 candelas per meter square. That's their setting, which is great if you're using it for games, movies, and things like that. You want something to be very bright, very contrasty, right? But if you're preparing for print or doing retouching jobs, then you want to lower that. And some standards recommend going from 80 candelas per meter square to anywhere to about 120. Now I would say 120 seems to be optimal one in most cases, unless you're comparing it to a certain print. We'll talk about that later. But 120 candelas per meter square seems to be kind of a more or less standards these days for web and so on and so forth, and also for other monitors and so on and so forth. But also, not every monitor will be able to just natively go below 120. So it might be very, very bright, like 300 candelas per meter square, right? And you calibrate it and you cannot just lower it. There's no setting to lower it natively to go below 120. So I think that's a good starting point, and we'll talk about when and why would you want to calibrate to a different setting. But just like we talked about before, if 120 candelas per meter square is the brightest thing in your room, then your eyes will think that's white, period. And there's no other brighter reference that will become white, right? So when you're calibrating, you need to take that into account, just like we did before. So that's why I think that if you calibrate to 120, at first, when you lower your luminance of your display, it might seem, from where it used to be, might seem that it's quite darker and that white is not really white, it's just light gray. But if you give it a little bit of time, it will become white, especially if it's the brightest thing in the room, and you will measure everything according to that white point. So that is something that you should take into account. Okay, now we're gonna start talking about the gamma. That's the only one that's a bit trickier one, so we'll move on to that one. Okay, so we talked about the white point, which is the color of white. We talked about the luminance, which is the brightness of white, or how bright the brightest point is. Now it's time to talk about gamma, or more specifically tone response curve of your display. So let's take a look what that is. Well, if you can imagine a gradient presenting the black and dark point, the two extremes, and all the different tones in between on your display, well, we can set black point in some of our calibration, more better calibration devices. In others we cannot, but we can set always a white point in terms of what would be the color of the white. That would be just called white point in when you're calibrating. And you can also set the luminance, or sometimes called brightness, which is basically measured in candelas per meter square, while the color of white is measured in kelvins. Now let's say we set those to 6500K or D65 if that's an option, and we set it to 120 candelas per meter square. Well, we have now set the black point and the white point. Those are the two extremes. Well, what about the middle tones and everything in between? Well, that's described by the tone response curve of your monitor. And if it's a very simple curve, it can be described by the gamma value. And that is the purpose of this video. Which gamma value should you choose, and what does all this mean, right? Well, let's start with something that you already know. Let's start with Photoshop curves. Now, Photoshop curves acts in the same way as the tone response curve. The only difference is that, for simplicity reasons, they have resetted the curve. So you have only this straight line that you see here, what we call a linear curve, right? It's just a straight line. That's where you begin. But it's also, if you take a look, it also says input and output. Well, gamma simply means it describes a relationship between input and output based on some formula. So the idea is that if you have a very simple tone response curve, you can describe that curve using a simple gamma value, and it uses that formula to describe it. If you have a very complex tonal curve, then you cannot use gamma value. And even though we heard the word gamma mentioned all the time, that's something you should remember. So tone response curve is something that displays images and everything has, but the gamma value only describes the simple tone response curves. So let's start with something we already know, and that's the Photoshop curves. You probably know that if you move it down, you darken an image. If you move it up, you brighten the image. And you can also modify individual curves, red, green, and blue, and as a result you can get some creative effects for your image, or you can even adjust for problematic color shifts or tonal problems and so on. Well, that's Photoshop curves, right? We're not going to talk about that. Instead, we're going to focus on the tone response curve, but I wanted to make a kind of like a comparison, because here we have a starting point that's just a straight line, right, with Photoshop curves. If you move it up, you brighten the image. Well, the same is true for the tone response curve of your monitor. If you start here and you move it up, you brighten the image. So it's the same principle as with the curve that you see in Photoshop. The only difference is that in tone response curve terms we start with this bent curve, not a straight line. so you don't get confused. It's the same principle of going up to brighten the image, going down to darken, but instead of having a straight curve, we have one that's bent. That's all. Okay, so here's where things gets a little bit more confusing. So I'll try to explain this as best I can. We have different tone response curves for printers, for scanners, for our images, as well as for our monitor. And they're related, but they're not always the same thing, and they're not always affecting one another in the same way. So let me show you what I mean. The tone response curve of the image itself can only be read in a color managed application, such as Photoshop. So what does that mean? Well, most images have an embedded profile. We have gamma encoding that's done when you basically save the image data, and then you have the reverse of that. It's called gamma decoding in a way, and you can see that in the profile of the image. So the Photoshop or any color managed application has to be able to read the profile within the image, and there has to be one inside of the image, so they have to have profile, they have to have application that can read the profile, and based on that it can display the image based on the gamma it should be displayed at, independently of the monitor. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. But sRGB is something we haven't talked about, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. sRGB is a profile that you see in most images, and it has a tone response curve that's very similar to gamma 2.2. It's not exactly, but overall it's very similar to gamma 2.2. So for the rest of this video we'll pretend that sRGB images are gamma 2.2. Okay, they have a tone response curve that's so easy that can be described by gamma 2.2. This is just for simplicity reasons. It's very similar to that, but it's not exactly the same thing. So for purists out there, it might present a problem. That's why I'm giving a disclaimer, right? We're gonna pretend it's 2.2. It's very close to it. So if you were to go in Photoshop, and I'll show you how this works later, we're going to talk about the profiles for images later. Right now we're talking about the monitor profile, but one relates to the other, so we're going to briefly mention the profile of the image here. Well, every image comes with a profile. It's basically like a DNA of the image, and inside you have certain values, and you can see here we have the gamma value, we have the white point, we're familiar with that, and we also have something that we call primaries, which basically describes red, green, and blue, or how much is the range of that image in terms of colors it can display. So the number of colors would be described by bit depth of the image, right? Well, the primaries in here, that displays the gamut, or the range of colors it can be displayed. How saturated the reds can it be displayed, how saturated the greens or the blues. We're going to discuss that quite a bit later. But what we're going to focus here is the gamma. And even though it says for sRGB it says gamma 2.2, even Photoshop is giving us an indication that you see under name it says simplified sRGB, so it cannot describe the actual tone response curve, so it's just using the gamma 2.2 value. So anyway, what I'm going to simplify this dialog box here just for comparison. We only want to focus on the gamma value here. Well, you can also see that we have Adobe RGB, which is another very popular bigger gamut profile, and it also has 2.2. So for majority of your images that you're going to be working with, they're going to have essentially 2.2 gamma described tone response curve, and that's one of the reasons why we might want to choose that for calibration of our monitor. It's pretty much a standard. Also Windows as an operating system, and now the newer Macs, are also 2.2 gamma. Basically they are expecting images to be 2.2. Well, let's now focus on the tone response curve, not of the image but of the monitor, of all the pixels you see on the screen. Right, well, typically monitors have very simple curves and can be described by gamma, so it's a very simple one, and we call that native gamma. You know, the kind of curve and the gamma value that came out of the factory. So let's say that this gamma curve, and you probably saw, let me go back, look at the image, it went brighter, right? Well, that's because the native gamma, it's not 2.2, but let's say it's 2.1 or the 1.9 or some other number, and this will depend on different monitors and manufacturers. Now each monitor ideally should be 2.2, but then usually not exactly, depending on the monitor and manufacturer. They can drift over time. That's why we need to calibrate. So if this is gamma 2.2 down there, you see that blue line, and the native gamma is red line. Well, we just saw how the monitor got brighter. That's because our native gamma makes the monitor brighter than the gamma of the image, or the native gamma. The standard gamma of 2.2. Well, this only matters. Let me go back. Here I'm showing you how the entire screen would look if the gamma of the monitor was the primary gamma, that everything was adjusted according to that. Well, things get a little bit trickier when you consider that only color managed applications such as Photoshop can actually correct for whatever gamma of the monitor is based on the profile of the image. And let's say it's sRGB, right, gamma 2.2. It will adjust our image independent of how everything else is adjusted, including the interface and everything. So that's something to keep in mind. Now let's say that the red square here represents everything on screen, right? And the blue one represents the gamma of the image. So if you were to view your image inside of Photoshop or any color managed application, they would adjust the gamma of the image to compensate for whatever gamma or brightness of your monitor is, based on the native gamma. Well, the problem happens is when we open our images in non-color managed applications, such as, Internet Explorer, for example. It doesn't read the profiles inside of images. So what you would get is a brighter image, or whatever the setting for your monitor is. So if you viewing your images a lot on web or other places, then calibrating to native gamma is probably not always a good idea, unless the native gamma is also 2.2. I'll talk about that later. So what we can do actually is we can calibrate our monitor to match the 2.2 gamma, just so that everything is in place, right? Because if we view our image inside of non-color managed application, then the native gamma is the primary one. It affects everything. If we view our images inside of color managed applications such as Photoshop, then the image itself gets compensated by the profile gamma found within the image. And here's what we would do. We would take the calibration device, we would measure what is the difference between those two curves, between the native curve and the one inside of an image, or the one we want to calibrate to. Let's say that's 2.2. It would write the difference inside of a little piece of data we call a monitor profile. This gets stored on your computer, and then that monitor profile is then embedded or read by your graphic card, which, take a look at the screen, would adjust whatever the bright native gamma is to match the gamma of the image, or if that's the gamma as we specified as target. Now let's go back to our gradient at the beginning. We have our white point, we have our black point, we have the tone response curve of our monitor describing everything in between, right? Well, imagine that gradient, and imagine here a monitor. I'm just going to use an image because it's easier to kind of comprehend what is going on. Now, one thing I want to point out, very important, is that from this moment on, I will pretend like we're not viewing this inside of Photoshop. I will pretend like everything is affected equally by the curve of the monitor. This is only because we're now focusing on the curve of the monitor, not on the image itself. But this is where it gives me an opportunity to explain how image and monitor have different gammas, and in color managed application they're affected differently. But here let's pretend that we somehow deactivated the color management for Photoshop, and Photoshop doesn't play a role anymore. Everything is affected by monitor from this moment on. Okay? Well, if this is a standard gamma we find in images, it's our operating system, everything is kind of set up for that. And I talked about how sRGB has that approximate gamma of 2.2, right? So that's where we get our image, 2.2 value. Well, the monitor gamma it can be 2.1. And let me go back. You see how image got brighter because 2.1 is brighter than 2.2. Well, what we need to do in our calibration, if we decide to tell the calibrator, hey, calibrate our monitor to gamma 2.2, this is what really happens. When we load our image, our profile inside of GPU, inside of our graphic card, what it does, it shifts that curve, right? It shifts it down to match whatever the native one was all the way to whatever the target was. Well, that's one option we can do. We can calibrate our monitor to gamma 2.2, and I just explained why. Also, another thing I want to mention is that if your native gamma is a lot brighter than the gamma of the image, what can happen is that even though Photoshop will compensate and it will display properly the image, the user interface can get quite a bit brighter. If you have a gamma that's, let's say, 1.9, like I have for my display, then it's gonna make the interface brighter, which ultimately is gonna affect not the image mathematically, but it will affect the perception you have with your eyes about how image is contrasty or not. Because if you remember, we're affected by the environment quite a bit. So calibrating everything to a standard makes more sense to me. Now you might also, if you talked about gammas, have heard about the gamma 1.8, and this is a legacy feature. Basically what happened is that back in the day, I think it was like 90s or mid 90s, early 90s, there was more and more digital images. I think at the beginning there were even black and white images. Well, the laser printers, Apple's laser printers and whatever they were preparing images to be printed on, were black and white, and I think the dot gain was set to 1.8, because remember, the printers also have the tones response curve, but in most cases their curve is more complex and it cannot be described with simple gamma value. Well, back then it was very easy for those simple prints, and it could be described by gamma. It was gamma 1.8. Well, at the time, PCs were less used and most of the Macs were used to prepare for print. And they didn't have at the time the color management system we have today with soft proofing, where you can simulate how an image would look on screen as it was printed. They didn't have that, so what they did is basically they said, well, we're gonna have something that's essentially a poor man's soft proofing, so they calibrated or set up their monitors to be 1.8 to match the printers, so that they get a match of what they're working on screen, how it's going to look when it's printed. Well, since the new Mac operating system, Mac OS 10, I believe that was from 2009 and upwards, Mac also switched to 2.2. So that's not a big issue anymore. So now we have Windows, all our images pretty much, then Mac new, and everything is 2.2. So that's pretty much a standard these days. Okay, so if you were to just decide to calibrate your monitor to 1.8, which you can, you would get a brighter image because it's less steep curve than 2.2, right? Well, there's also one other curve we have to worry about. It's like kind of like a new kid on the block. It's what we refer to as L-star, and this comes from the lab or LAB mode. It's basically one that describes essentially the brightness of our eyes, and it's a bit more complex curve. It's the one you see here, which is illustrated with the white color. This is just an approximation of it. It's kind of like illustration. It may not be perfectly accurate, but the idea is that it gives you a better distribution of tones across the board, and it also, I think, gives you a better shadow details. Well, when would you want to calibrate to this? Some people recommend you should always calibrate to this. You get better gradients and all that. I'm not sure that's a valuable solution, since first of all, most of your images are 2.2, right? Your Photoshop will adjust for that anyway, so I'm not sure that's a valid statement, but let's say it is. I think you would need to experiment. But there is one situation where it really makes sense. There is a profile for images which is called ECI RGB, and is designed to replace essentially Adobe RGB when preparing for print, like a pre-press environment. And it has, instead of gamma value for its profile, it has L-based. It's an L-based color space. So matching your calibration with that, if you're working with that a lot and preparing for pre-press using that, makes more sense, right? So in that case I would go with L star definitely. There's also an option that you calibrate to monitor native gamma, and the idea is that if you move the curve from its native position, you're affecting the quality of the image on screen. Because let's say you have an 8-bit monitor and you have an 8-bit graphic card, that's like taking your image inside of Photoshop, which is 8-bit, and moving your curve around to affect the quality of the image. Now in my opinion, that's not going to affect it that much, because we see what we can do with curves in 8-bit images inside of Photoshop and still get away with it, right? So it's not that drastic. I think that they've exaggerated that a bit. And also I would rather have a little bit of gradient problem on my screen and have all my images and everything displayed on the same brightness than have brighter interface and brighter images in non-color managed application just to get a slightly better gradient. And sometimes it doesn't matter anyway, because on 8-bit monitors you're probably going to have gradient issues anyway. So in my opinion, you should calibrate to 2.2 or L star if you're using that ECI RGB colors profile. But also I would like to point out that if your monitor gamma is 2.2 natively or something very, very close to that, then you might want to calibrate to native gamma. And also not all calibrators allow you to calibrate to native gamma, but pretty much all of them will say you can choose 2.2. So just so you know. Well, there's also some other things we need to consider when calibrating or moving our curve around. First one is that you have to be able to move it for whatever your native one was to whatever your target is. Let's say that's 2.2. So you have to move it. Then you also have to take into account that we have RGB curves, right? It's not just one curve, it's also RGBs. And if you don't match them properly, what you can get is shifts in, tints of color, and you get a color tint, color shifts. So you get different parts of your gradients and so on, and interface having not completely gray color, but maybe more greenish, more yellowish, more bluish, so on. So we need to match them. Some more higher end displays, more higher end monitors have, I think, what they call 3D lookup display, which can basically tie all of them together inside a monitor. So when you adjust them with your graphic card, you're adjusting them all in the same manner. So there's not a problem with this. But most monitors will have this. And also we have to take into account that curve, if it's not perfectly shaped, can give us not such an even distribution of tones across the gradient, as you can see here. Now this is grossly exaggerated, it's not exactly like this, but I'm giving you an idea of another thing we have to worry about. And the last thing on the end, I also wanted to point out that I would like to show you basically my own curve and my own calibration, right? So I have Spider 3 Elite, which allows me to show you where the curve was before it was calibrated, where I'm going to target it, and how it is after calibration. And I thought it would be useful to kind of demonstrate this in a real world example. So let's take our uncalibrated curve. For this particular monitor, the gamma was, I believe it was 1.9, and as you can see, not all of them are very evenly matched, all the RGB curves. So we have red, green, and blue not in the same position, which gave me shifts in color, and everything was quite brighter. Now the target was 2.2, and as you can see, this blue line represents 2.2, and it's quite lower down. So as you can imagine, originally my monitor was brighter quite a bit, and also it wasn't perfectly had color tints. So let me deactivate the target now, and let's go back to calibrated version. So this is after calibration, and I'll deactivate my uncalibrated version, so you can see only the calibrated curves, and they're not perfectly aligned, but they're close enough, right? The red, green, and blue. Here where you see a little bit thicker line at the bottom, and here that's where they don't match perfectly, but they're very, very close. So I don't get all that color tints, maybe a little bit. It's an older monitor, so could probably do a better job. But what I'm showing you is that if I compare this with a target, it almost goes one on top of the other, right? So that would be calibration for my monitor. And if we compare this to uncalibrated version, you can see that no wonder my monitor was brighter than it should be, and it's also it was unevenly distributed across the RGB curves. So I think this concludes this video. Thank you for watching.